All right, guys, welcome to the psychology personality part two. Today, what we're going to do is look at. I want to just say a couple of last comments about Freud and Jung, and then we're going to get into. If I just kind of scan ahead here, we're going to look at how the unconscious is sometimes measured in indirect ways. Like this is sometimes psychologists use it to try to get after maybe not necessarily the unconscious, but just general reactions to things. And then we'll get into humanistic psychology and its approach to personality, and then the big five traits of the trait approach. So this will go pretty fast. Let's get into it then. I wanted to jump back to talk a second about an important concept from Carl Jung. And the idea with him and the collective, one way to think about the collective unconscious for him is that, again, our psychology, our personality is highly influenced by the forces within the collective unconscious that are, these themes that are guiding our behavior. So, for example, imagine, you have a new parent who is not, like maybe he or she is not very, not really wanting to be part of this person's not wanting to be a parent, right? And they're maybe they had the baby and they weren't done with like things they wanted to do in their life or something. And so here you've got a couple of different archetypes, right? You have the archetype or the theme of parent and the archetype or theme of, let's say, young socialite or something like this. And if what Jung would say here, one way to think about this is if someone is kind of denying one of the archetypes within them, right, then that's going to lead to dysfunction. So like psychological dysfunction, maybe it's anxiety or depression or something. So when we don't fully embrace all the different archetypal structures that are influencing us in our life, and we kind of reject one that's clearly present, then that could cause problems. So one way to think about personality is, to what extent am I attaching myself to one personality? In high school, I use my students saying, the athletes in the room, if you fully identify with athlete archetype, that's one thing, but are you not accepting the other archetypes, the student archetype, the friend archetype, the and then the hero archetype, all these other archetypes, you're focusing more on just the one, and that could lead to someone feeling like an incomplete. Or if I'm only a student and I don't do anything else in my life, then I'm the student archetype. But then you've kind of turned away from all these others. So the idea is kind of embracing the different archetypes that kind of emerge in our life throughout the lifespan. Going back to Freud for a second on this idea of the unconscious, for him, all of our, like we said yesterday, all of our behavior is, guided by this unconscious, either directly or indirectly. Either I understand why I'm doing it, because I have this impulse. Let's say I'm hungry, so I eat, or whatever. But a lot of what we do is also guided by our unconscious in a way that we are unaware of or we're less aware of, right? So like defense mechanisms are a really good example of explaining the things we're doing, but from an unconscious point of view. This is really different from other thinkers in the sense that the emphasis here is something harder to measure, harder to see, whereas like in behaviorism, with Skinner and the idea of operant conditioning, when it comes to personality, for Skinner, this is all nonsense. He's not going to talk about this at all. He's going to talk about things like, punishments and rewards and what happens over time in shaping, molding behavior. It has nothing to do with this black box, if you will, of the mind that these thinkers are trying, especially Freud, trying to say, okay, this is the cause in the shaping of our personality. So really, really different in terms of 2 points of view, Freud and Skinner. Now they were both, in one way they're very similar is they're both they're both very deterministic. Skinner's arguments are about all of our personalities determined by, the pushes and pulls of the environment. So the pulls would be the reinforcements, the things we want, the pushes, the punishments. And that's who we become. We are shaped into the concept, shaping from learning psychology, shaped into the person that we are through our experiences. And there's no really room for free will there. With Freud, same thing. Freud doesn't put any stock in free will. He says it's called psychic determinism, this idea that our unconscious mind is driving so much of what we do. Now, those drivers, whether it's being punishments and reinforcements or unconscious pieces, are really different. Okay, and so we kind of talked about the archetypes and pieces and things. I mentioned the opposites and how really at the end of the day, for Jung and Freud, when we think about this from a psychodynamic perspective, this is about the unconscious. And there's a few techniques, not just measuring the unconscious. This is probably a title I should clean up. But, it's used. What they do sometimes, I offer what are called thematic apperception tests. And what these do is they present the person with a a drawing or a photo, but usually a drawing. And you're supposed to write a brief narrative of what's going on. So I'll show you these images, and just for you and yourself, tell me, think for yourself, what is going on in this image? Like, give me the story in a short paragraph. Like, what's going on right here, right? And you can pause it here if you want, come up with something. Let's do another one. So here's another one. So again, just what just happened, right? Fill in the blanks. What just happened? Tell me the story here. Don't tell me what you're seeing, like a guy standing here. Tell me why. What is happening? What's the context? It's another one. Okay. So here you have these three. So, for example, if someone's like, well, this is a young woman and her grandmother or her mother is over her shoulder judging her and everything she's doing, the question becomes, okay, what's your relationship with your mom? Or if this is her future self, or her, looking over looking at her in the passing, or judging her in some way. Like, depending upon whatever the person says about the image, to what extent does that reveal things that you're dealing with, right? Like here, when I ask this to students, everyone says something from, he killed this person and now he's in despair, to he just woke up and the light's shining, and he's blind, he's like covering his eyes, so it's very kind of literal. You also have other people saying, oh, he cheated on his wife and he's feeling all this remorse now, or she's passed out, something like this. Here, students usually have a really good one for this, where it's like, sometimes like the teacher is judging the student, always watching, always judging kind of thing. Sometimes the students flip it and say the teacher's modeling it. It's kind of interesting. And same thing here. This is very similar to the other one. Here, it's, he's everything from he's this abusive husband, or he's dead, or he's this brother coming back and he's sick from war, who knows. But the idea is that you've got all these different themes, and the idea is to connect it to what that might say about what you're grappling with. In a way, this is not radically different from dream interpretation. The only difference here would be, like, imagine, rather than this image, it's a dream that you had. Now try to interpret, why did you interpret your dream the way you did? That might reveal some of your own psychology. And then you have the Rorschach test, is the ink blot test, where you look at these, you look at these ink blots, and you're supposed to have a sense of what do you see here, kind of thing, right? And there's just different cards. Again, these tests are highly subjective. There's nothing about these measurements that are tried and true, or like, this always means that. And you see humans here, that's something that's terrible, or it's something normal, or something great. Like, it's just, oftentimes I think what psychologists try to look for are themes in images, and for number one, it's really normal for the human brain to try to find in things, people, things that we look like, right, or faces, or animal structures. That's all pretty normal, because that's what we do. We search the environment for that kind of stuff anyway. And so when we see it in abstract ways, we can easily kind of come up with a version of it. It's a little bit like cloud watching clouds, and you seeing things in clouds. All right, the next perspective is called the humanistic approach, and it's called the third force because you had Freud as the first, Skinner and the learning approach as the second, and those really dominated psychology for the first half of the last century, the 20th century. And it wasn't until like the 60s that the humanistic approach really took off. It was before that too, but the idea is that in the second half of the century, you have this return to humanistic ideas and principles. And giving an alternative to the intense Freudian unconscious forces of sex drive and stuff like that. And then you have Jung and Carl Jung and the this very abstract collective unconscious. And then you have the Skinnerian, and that's a very European model. And then in the United States, you had this really strong learning perspective of Skinner and operant conditioning and very mechanical. And if you look at, like we said before, Americans, public schools are based on Skinnerian principles of shaping and molding people into things, right? Students into what we want. That's very operant conditioning, right? So the military is like that too. This idea, I'm going to condition you and shape you into the soldier or person that is what we want. So Carl Rogers and the humanistic approach brings forth a brand new level here. And you could try this. This is something you could try to do to get your head wrapped around a little bit of this. By the way, when I teach humanistic psych in my classes and the other, it's like I dive more into this in Psych 114. In my abnormal psychology class, I jump into it a lot because when you interpret mental illness, one way you interpret it is through a humanistic perspective. And so this is more of just an introduction piece, and then in other classes you might dive deeper into it. So one way to kind of wrap our head around it is to try to imagine, draw two stick figures of yourself, right? Like, they don't need to be shaking hands or anything. But, around one of the drawings of yourself, write down the things you feel you ought to be. So this is the key. This is the key here. So you would write down, let's imagine you've got, or you just be like two circles, right? It's fine. And you write down, here are all the things I ought to be, I ought to be all these things. And we just kind of write these things down, right? And then write down the expectations that others have of you. So this is like part of this, right? Okay. Sorry. Okay. That is what do you feel you most live up to in order to be accepted, like loved and respected. So in other words, I have to be all of these things to get this from people, right? That kind of goes into one. And we'll hold off on the second one, but that's where I have to be the best parent, I have to be the best student, all A's kind of thing. Oh boy. And then the second one, write down characteristics that describe you without concern for expectations or conditions. Who are you more naturally? So in the other circle, forget having to win people's affection and judgment and acceptance. Just who are you without all that stuff? And this is harder in a sense because we spend so much time probably over here in the world of I ought to be like this and I'm trying to be like this so I get people to love me and respect me. But what about, imagine that was all given. Imagine you have to worry about that at all. What would be left? Who would you really be without any kind of judgment or any kind of filter? What are some of the characteristics of the real you in that sense, right? So we'll get into that. We'll come back to this. Okay, so Carl Rogers argued that part of human personality is, or actually the base of all personality is what's something called actualizing tendency, which is the innate drive to reach one's fullest potential. So the idea behind this is that we are born with, so one way to think about this is when you're developing as a young child, your body is developing too, right? It's designed to go to a certain height, to a certain kind of body shape, and it's actualizing itself, right? It's developing. And if our bodies literally develop, right, because our bones get bigger, we get taller, muscles become more tense, all this kind of stuff builds. That trajectory is what he's calling actualizing tendency. The tree outside wants to grow or has an actualizing tendency to grow to be its fullest possible tree that it can be, right, given the environment. So it has this actualizing principle to it, like I'm going to grow into something, and almost like it's kind of predestined. It's like there's this design. You're going to get, like, for us genetically, we're going to get so tall, and then we stop growing, right? We've reached that point. So in a perfect condition, I've grown to my height my potential is at, and I'm not encumbered by anything, and that's what Rogers is talking about. But stop thinking about that in terms of the physical characteristics like height, and think of it more in terms of personality. What is the personality that you're supposed to be growing into? He's calling that we all have this actualizing tendency. And part of that is a tendency towards, our personality tends to be towards freedom and self-sufficiency. So for Rogers, everyone's personality is projected to be an autonomous and self-sufficient person. It doesn't mean we don't want or need attachments. It's just that we are a functional individual, right? And that whole process is towards a positive, constructive, this is really key, and adaptive behaviors. So this is important. So, and this also really contrasts with Freud in that what human personality, according to Rogers, we want to be productive. We want to do things. We want to make things. We want to have a positive impact on things around us. We don't want to just destroy things. That's not the normal human reaction to stuff. And it's also positive. People seek happiness. People want to be happy. We don't seek despair, right? And for not that Freud says we seek despair or destruction, but for Freud, it's all of the above. This idea that that we there is a part of us that's absolutely destructive for Freud. Whereas Rogers is saying, well, nobody really wants to do that. We do it either by accident or we do it in a way that we think ultimately is going to help us, but it doesn't. So Rogers says you can see the same actualized tendency in animals. I like this photo. I took this photograph up in the Central Oregon, which is all this volcanic region, and hiking around this giant area where there's all this just volcanic rock everywhere. It's just high rock upon rock upon rock, and you're hiking through these. Literally, it's like mountains of rock everywhere. You can walk through these walls of rock, and you find these trees just clinging to life. And when I saw that, I'm like, this is so Rogers here. Like, it's amazing how nature will actualize. So here you've got seed landed somehow, and it did what it could to grow. And it struggles. So it's almost like the grass growing through cracks in concrete. Like, there is this clear actualizing tendency to develop, and you see it in nature all around us. And now things can get in its way. Things can restrict that kind of growth. But the idea is that there is this normal tendency there. It's just almost like have you ever seen like a tree growth or vines grow through a fence, or tree branch grow through a fence? It's like it's so destined to grow, wants to grow, it just kind of finds its way through the fence. So or goes around it. So you've got the same thing in us. We have this actual tendency in our own personality. Now he also has something called organismic valuing. Organismic valuing is the claim that the things that are good for us are the things that we prefer. At the end of the day, we want things. And one way I try to explain this is, like, okay, Skittles are not good for you if you're eating Skittles all the time. But Skittles are based on flavors that we like. Strawberries and berry and orange. And all of those natural things are good for us, right? So all it's done is it's been processed, right? So healthy, sugary foods like fruits and vegetables, fruits in particular, are just that it's become synthetic, and we think, oh my gosh, it's so good, but really it's based on things that are truly good for us, right? So Rogers is saying the things that we ultimately want, things that are good for us. Now it doesn't mean abuse doesn't happen, or abuse of something doesn't happen, or getting into artificial versions of it. All right, so it's almost like, well, we're sexual creatures, and sexual behavior is something that people prefer, but we can also see, well, they could go too far. Something like anything from, it's unhealthy to be, watching pornography all day. In terms of it's like having a healthy sexual relationship that can actually harm a healthy sexual relationship. So that's kind of the more artificial version of this, right? Positive regard. All humans, according to Rogers, need positive regard. So we have this innate need to feel loved by other people. And this shouldn't surprise us this much. We've seen this course already, the clear biological requirements, everything from Harlow's monkeys, right, to the touch studies that you guys watched, we talked about oxytocin as a hormone that's so important for attachments. So we really need this. We need to feel loved, right? Now, in order for us to look inward and have that positive self-regard, according to Rogers, we have to have this coming from somewhere. We can't just say, you know what, I like myself. I have all this high self-esteem, high self-worth, positive self-image, and although I get zero positive from anybody else. That's really hard. For Rogers, it's required we have people in our life, especially while growing up, that love us, right, in this way. And without that, it's going to be very difficult to have positive self-regard. Really what ends up happening is, if without this, I have lower self-esteem, lower self-worth, lower positive self-image when I'm not having a lot of this. I'd mentioned before about adult children of alcoholics who grow up in these homes of alcoholism, and they find that there's a lot of this. There's a lot of low self-esteem in adulthood. Why? Because where was mom and dad during the day and during the night when giving the child attention and making them feel good about themselves, all those kinds of things. It wasn't there, right? Or not necessarily all alcoholics, but that's the idea. So without this, we feel helpless, small, and fail to actualize. So this is the key. I can't reach my fullest potential. I can't grow into that personality, like the tree trying to grow, and a tree growing in wonderful soil and lots of sun and lots of water, it can reach its potential. A tree growing among the rocks, it's going to struggle to reach its potential because of the environmental restrictions. So what are some of those restrictions? Environmental restrictions for us, Rogers calls conditions of worth. So here, the things that slow us down towards fully achieving who we are as a full-fledged person is that we are surrounded by these things. So conditions of worth are basically, according to Rogers, the conditions that are laid upon us that say, look, if you want me to respect you, if you want me to care about you, if you want me to love you, right, you need to be like this. It's almost like if you're not cool enough, I won't talk to you. If you're not this enough, I'm not going to hang out with you. If you're not this. So we judge each other, and we have this, you have to be a certain way for me to give you any of my attention, right? So parents, teachers, peers only give us what we need when we show we are worthy, rather than just because we need it. So this comes in lots of different ways. If we go back to that circle, the first circle you made, these, in a lot of ways, these are all these conditions. I got to be like this. I got to be like that. I got to be, all of these things for people to love me. And so this could be everything from personality based, like smart or funny or I'd be kind all the time, whatever it is, to physical things. Like I have to be beautiful, I have to be muscular, I have to be in this great shape or whatever, or people won't like me, people won't respect me. Right? So the condition of worth would be, you have to be something, right? And this could be different for males and females. In our society, we definitely have different, as large social expectations heaped upon the different genders. And one of them, at least for females, you can see conditions of worth being heavily tied to their bodies, and this could lead especially young girls, to eating issues, eating disorders. So the conditional positive regard be powerful conditions to define society that cause us to bend ourselves into shape. So what we do is, the conditional positive regard is, I will give you the positive regard under these conditions, and then what we do is we chase it. We shape and twist ourselves from an early age to try to meet all of these things. So I got to check. I'm doing all these things. I'm being all these things that people are telling me to be, and I'm kind of bending myself. No one's perfect of all this. In fact, you guys are probably getting the idea that you'll never achieve this. You'll never fulfill the whole thing perfectly. There's no end to it. There's always going to be something more that you could do, or people are going to want you to do, or feel that society is telling you to do, and you're never going to be enough. It's never going to be perfect. So we bend, and this is, of course, not who we are naturally. And so we're not following orgasmic valuing. Because we're following the conditions of worth, the conditional positive regard. This is what I'm chasing. I'm chasing this. I'm not chasing this. And therefore, I'm actually stuck. I'm developmentally arrested in the sense that I'm going down a path that's really not necessarily my nature, right? Because I'm chasing these other things in order to get this. Because at the end of the day, what do we want? We want positive regard. and we are doing all these things to try to get it, right? And this eventually can be very destructive. And again, especially when you look at a developing person, like I've had a lot of students in my high school classes that are just racked with expectations, right? And they feel like if they don't do certain things, they'll get judged and people won't like them, they won't respect them anymore, all of this stuff. And so it just kind of it can kind of tear them down. It makes them anxious, make them stressed out, depressed. Lots of things can kind of come from chasing this. Now, the conditional positive self-regard is where things get really nasty. So what's going on here is that first circle that, okay, these are the things I have to be like in order for people to love me kind of stuff, right? That first circle. In a way, this is kind of outside of us, right? Because you're saying, well, other people are saying this about me. But eventually this kind of goes into our own mind, right? And we say, look, I didn't measure up. I don't like myself, right? I'm not good enough. Right? So here I say, look, in order for me to like myself, I need to meet those same conditions. So we internalize them. We begin to like ourselves only if we meet up with the standards others have applied to us, rather than if we truly actualizing our potential. So this is the problem, right? This is where if I say you can imagine a coach, a teacher, a parent, whatever, boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, wife, friend, employer, if I'm not meeting their standards, then I guess I'm not good enough, and I own it. So I interpret this, in high school, you can imagine if a teacher's like, well, you're not a good student, you're not a very good student, you're not a very good this, you're not very good that. That's very easy for a young person in particular to internalize it and say, well, yeah, I guess I'm not, because this person is telling me I'm not. The unconditional positive regard is what Roger says is what really is key. This love one receives without conditions. So let's stop for a second. We do this to other people, right? Like we hold our affection and our attention and our efforts towards people based on they have to do certain things, right? Like we do this. We don't just give out our positive regard to everybody freely. I'll be nice to you if you show me you're nice to other people, whatever it is. We have these conditions, okay? These conditions, and it's really rare that we give this out, right? Like, I'm going to unconditionally give you this positive regard no matter what. And it's also rare that we get it. So when I ask students, for example, who in your life gives you unconditional positive regard, I'll have some students raise their hand and say, my mom or my dad, or they really struggle. They're not sure who, or they'll say like my dog, and that's true. Your dog does, but the idea here is that and then of course I ask them, who do you give it out to? Do you give it out? And they'll sometimes say friend or whatever, but you can kind of tell sometimes like, well, I don't know. I mean, like this is hard to do, right? Now parents are like, okay, my child. You'll see more of that. So this is what people look for, and this is not unconditional positive regard. Is not simply, okay, I'm just gonna like support you no matter what you do. So you can imagine, let's say a parent has a drug addict for a son or daughter, and they're really struggling with this drug addiction, and they wouldn't say, hey, let me help you get more of your drug today, or hey, let me you can sit home all day long and do that, and I'll buy it for you, or whatever. That's not unconditional positive regard. It's I'm going to love you and help you and do everything I can for you. Even though you're doing this to yourself, I'm not going to abandon you. I'm going to try to get you to stop, but I'm not going to support that, but I'll always support you as a human being, as a person. That's the idea here, right? It's not just, becoming a doormat to other people. It's look, I can be upset with you. I can be like sometimes with like a student and teacher relationship, like where I've had students who've like done things, and you're like, they did, they cheated. Let's say they cheated on a test, right? And they feel they're kind of coming, they say, oh man, I plagiarized this, or I cheated on this. And I remember once he was like, you probably think I feel like a terrible person and all this kind of stuff. I'm like, we all make mistakes, like, and you learn from that, and that's really important. But my view of you hasn't changed. I don't dislike you. I don't have any I still want to support you in every way. So, but that doesn't mean I accept the bad the bad example. I don't accept the cheated test, right? I give opportunities for recovery, or maybe, but the idea is that that's what I mean unconditional positive regard means. So for Rogers, ultimately this builds up to what are called the two selves. There's the real self, which is founded in actualized intent. So this is where if you try to turn down all of those conditions of worth and refocus on what it is that you are meant to become, who are you really, that second circle, right? And you follow what you know is good for you. For example, if you know what's good for you is to, you always feel better about yourself if you do these things, or I always feel really good after I, spend time doing this. Or when I eat healthy, when I don't, whatever you do, following what that value is telling you, right? And then when it comes to receiving positive regard, and then of course to yourself, if people in your life are not giving you this unconditional positive regard, then you need to find people in your life that give that to you. If you don't have right, so that would be the exercise in the real self, surrounding yourself with people that love and accept you for who you are, and not trying to be something that you're not, because that's, for Rogers, is a way of not living the authentic life. You're going to be living this unauthentic life. The ideal self is the self that is imposed by conditions of positive regard. So here it's the self that's been formed by all these expectations. So, like when I was in college, I remember a lot of my friends were like, "I'm going to be an engineer." I'm like, "Well, why do you want to be an engineer?" Like, "Oh, because it's like cool." I'm like, that had nothing to do with like the authentic. I just love this, the field. It's just, and it really just came down to I want to be a respected person and have a respectable job. But then that's just following this. What do you mean by respected? So why can't you do something that you feel really great about and not have to follow that? So an ideal self is not a bad thing. It's not that you've got the real self here and the ideal here. It's not that, we have to avoid the ideal self and only focus on that. There are things in the ideal self that we need, right? Like we want to be, terrible job doing this, but it's just that we have to kind of emphasize this more than probably what we do. Really that ideal self is always going to be out of reach, where this isn't. This is always within reach. Okay. Then you have the incongruity for Rogers is the gap between the real and ideal self. So the idea is that the further apart these two are, right, the more unhappy I am, the more anxious I am, because my life is I'm like torn, right? Or I'm living the unauthentic life over here, and I want to be these things. Now, if I'm over here, and and this is great. If you can be over here and feel totally, the people around you are giving you all that love and acceptance, that's great. But the idea is that you want to try to get these two selves to overlap as much as possible. So when you overlap the selves, you're lining up all of the positive regard you need from other people, right? You're kind of here, right, these conditions, and they're in sync with who you really are. So this is where, when we live the authentic life, part of that is making sure that we surround ourselves with people that really care and love us. His approach to therapy, we'll come back to this, but just to give you a sense of it, what Rogers does in this, it's called client-centered approach, is he doesn't assume that he has the answers. Like with Freud, he has the answers. He's going to probe into your unconscious mind and try to make sense of what is going on. What are those evil forces down there? What are the things that are bothering you? The anxieties that may lead to the fears that may lead to dysfunction, like psychological illness. For someone like B.F. Skinner, it's all about manipulating you with reinforcement and punishment. So for example, if someone who's depressed, Skinner would just be like, well, you need more reinforcement in your life. You need to do things that make you happy during the day more often. Up that stuff. There's a huge problem with that. We'll get to next week. But and going back to depression with Freud, depression could come from you're depressed about X when you're upset about something that's in the unconscious mind, like you've lost or something you feel like you are inferior in some way. With Rogers, there's not really, all he's going to try to do is get you closer to here. And the way he does that is basically when the person speaks about their whatever is bothering them, all he does is reiterate what they said. So here's the key, right? In order for me to be here, and I know if the closer I'm here, the more these overlap, the happier, the less anxious, the more authentic I'll be, and the happier I'm going to be, more psychologically healthy I'll be. So why are you over here? You're over here because you lack that positive regard for the things who you are as a genuine person. So what he needs to do is have you explore whatever your anxieties are and show you this, give it to you, and accept you as a person. And all of a sudden you'll start pushing over here. So, you can imagine, you sit down with someone like Rogers and he's like, what brings you in today? And you say, well, I'm having a really hard time in my relationship, right? Okay. So you're here today because you have a really hard time in your relationship. Yeah, because, and he wants you, he doesn't put words in your mouth. He doesn't try to get you to say more. He just literally makes sure that he interprets what you just said and shows it to you. And he shows you unconditional positive regard in the meantime. Like you are a valuable, worthy, important person. And what he argues is that people themselves can find their way to their own happiness, their own mental health. Because really, you're the only one that can do it in his mind. You just need that guide to bring you back onto your path towards actualizing tendency into the real who you really are. Because at the end of the day, guys, we can't be anybody else authentically. We are who we are, and so, but we got to make sure that we also understand that lots of obstructions can make us think we are somebody that we're not, right? Like, oh, see, I'm this bad person, and that's my real self. No, remember, Rogers, the real self is always positive. It's always constructive. And so if I find myself, man, I really don't like who I am and who I've become, well, part of that is like the tree growing up amongst the fence. Or in the rocks. It's bent and had a shape, or it was pushed and pulled in certain ways. You've got to free yourself of those past things and see that, okay, wait a minute, I need to heal. I need to see the good person that's really within me. Okay. The trait approach to personality is, and the textbook kind of goes over, we already talked about Maslow's hierarchy of needs and back in motivation psychology, and sometimes Maslow comes up in personality as well, kind of saying that my personality is based on where I'm at on that hierarchy of needs. Going back to psychodynamic, you got Freud and Jung, but if we look at last week with Eric Erickson's theory is 8 stages of development. His psycho stages of development are also very personality based. So he's also psychodynamic in that sense. He's a Freudian in that he's just adding that social element to it. Okay, the last theory here is the trait approach. And the trait approach is the single most accepted theory in personality in terms of it's the most popular one, right? The average psychologist can say, well, personality is measured in terms of traits. So, and the most famous of that is with the 5-factor model, or the Big Five. So here we go. Trait theories are basically, what's saying here is that this view stress that personality consists of broad, enduring dispositions or traits that tend to be characteristic of responses. So this is really important. And the idea behind this is that if I were to check in on you today, tomorrow, a year from now, 2 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, right? And I give you this personality test, it's probably going to be the same. Like it's measuring traits that are long lasting, right? If someone is really extroverted as an adult, they're probably going to be extroverted as an elderly person. Now, can these things change? Absolutely. There's been examples of like, when I was a little kid, I was super extroverted, but now as a teen, I'm really introverted. Yes, right? So, but the argument is that for the most part, these traits are pretty long lasting. Now, this sounds like that. Remember that, are you a caterpillar or butterfly, or are you a seedling or tree, right? And this sounds more like the tree approach. These traits just get more mature, but they're kind of, the structure's there. Traits are not the same as states. States are not enduring. So a state would be something like, it's a temporary experience. So for example, if let's say I'm really pessimistic right now because, this situation fell on me and I'm feeling really down in the dumps about it, that doesn't mean I'm a pessimist generally speaking, right? It just means that in this small window, I'm experiencing this state, all right? So we have to get rid of that and watch out. We're looking for really much more important building blocks of personality. Trait theories primarily describe personality. This is really key. And offer less of an explanation. So what's so important about this compared to Freud, Rogers, Skinner, Bandura, all these different personality theorists or theories that relate to personality is that trait theories don't take issue with trying to explain why something's happening. They're just telling you what's happening. So, this is the kind of person that you are, right? I don't know. I'm not going to get into how or why. It's just this is what it is. So trait theories just want to describe personality and not try to just explain, what it is per se. So the textbook talks about this, but basically in short, what the big 5 factor model of personality comes from is the idea is that if you take all these different, when you think of, okay, list all the characteristics of a personality, warm, intelligent, funny, like whatever, like intellectual or like cold or really exploratory, like whatever. You just think of all these different characteristics that you think make up a personality. And what something a process called factor analysis does is it takes all those terms and tries to cook them down. Like there's no point in me saying warm, kind, nice, thoughtful or generous, all into one, and have all these different terms that all really, really overlap, right? Like I'm not sure nice versus warm, really, really a lot of overlap there, right? So the factor analysis cooks all this down, and what the 5 factor models argues is that all of human personality comes down to 5 key traits, right? And here they are. There's openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Now, I really want to emphasize something here. All of these are basically spectrums. So there's somewhere along the openness spectrum and the conscientious spectrum, right? And the extroversion spectrum. It's not just one or the other. You're not just, I'm open, right? It's a matter of degree. So let's walk through these. So openness to experience is linked with, and you can kind of see these kind of general claims. Liberal values, open-mindedness, tolerance, creativity, superior cognitive function, IQ scores across a lifespan, distinctive dress, entrepreneurial goals, social media use, long live. So here you have what openness basically means is how open I am to new experiences versus I don't like new things. I don't like change. I don't want to be challenged with new ideas or to have to be confronted with anything that, pushes my position of reality, okay? So that's openness, how open somebody is. Conscientiousness is another factor that really gets after, how, not just how organized I am, careful, just and you can see here, I should have done this one first. You can kind of see the spectrum here, right, for openness, how imaginative you are versus just being very practical, how interested you are in variety versus routine, independent versus conforming. So like on the other side of openness would be, very routine or closed, right? I'm closed to new experiences. I just do what kind of is the thing to do here. On the other side of conscientious, so someone's organized versus being disorganized, careful versus careless, disciplined versus impulsive. Conscientiousness is, in a way, is like to what extent does my actions affect other people? Or, I don't want to do this assignment, but I want to do it the best of my ability because I want to be a conscientious student, right? I believe that there's a duty to things. So conscientious, almost like you're on a bus or you're on the train and it's crowded and the person with their legs spread taking up all the space, it's not a really conscientious person in that moment versus, well, hey, there's people around me. I want to try to make room for others. That's being conscientious as well. Extroversion the opposite. This is probably the most known one: extroverted versus introverted, right? So here's sociable or retiring, fun-loving or sober, energetic or reserved. So extroverted in this sense is what most of you guys have heard before, where it's like, hey, the more extroverted I am, the more I like being social. When I'm around people, I like talking. I don't mind if everyone's kind of focusing on me, or I don't mind being the center of attention or whatever it is. That's an extroverted person, right? I get pleasure from being around other people. Introvertedness tends to be a little bit more somber and reserved. But so, for example, like I like being around other people, but that can be kind of stressful or can be a lot, and I don't want the limelight on me. I don't want all that center of attention. Agreeableness, soft-heartedness, or ruthless. So agreeableness goes into that nice, kind category, right? So soft-heartedness versus ruthless, trusting versus suspicious, helpful versus uncooperative. So the more agreeable I am as a teacher, I'll have positive assumptions of my students, right? Like, okay, someone turned it in, or let's say someone turned something in and it's plagiarized. Okay, well, my initial might be, okay, that was a mistake. Like, they may not understand that, you shouldn't just copy stuff out, and maybe they were unsure of the situation, versus I don't care, F or 0, and report you to admin. So that could be part of agreeableness. And then finally, neuroticism. This is the emotional stability spectrum. So for example, if I worry a lot, if I get stressed out easily, if I get afraid more easily, then I'm on that anxious side of neuroticism. The more calm I am, the more collected I try to be, I am, then the more emotionally stable I am, right? So for example, this whole COVID thing, when this whole thing went down and the schools shut down, there were people who had a really hard time at first. Who were just like, this is, especially some of my seniors in high school, they just were not handling it, which is understandable, well at all. While others were like, okay, let's just take it one day at a time. You kind of got the sense of that from them. So, okay, so this is the big five. And you can kind of read here, some of these get associated with certain characteristics. Now, this is not like set in stone. It's just that people with these traits tend to be certain ways. So, for example, and a lot of this shouldn't surprise us, like someone who's more open tends to be more exploratory, right? They lean towards the creative side. People who are conscientious, they tend to do much better in school. Well, that makes sense. They're more organized. They're more aware of what they need to do. They feel more like motivated to do well. They usually do better in work. They generally they'll dress nicely, better quality friendships and higher religious faith, less likely to have substance abuse issues. Because even if they go down this road, they'll like, this is the wrong thing to be. I shouldn't let myself go. This is not what, even though part of me may want to, it's something that I think is the wrong thing to do. Extroversion is linked with social activities, experience gratitude, strong sense of meaning in life. Agreeableness linked with generosity, altruism, religious, more satisfying romantic relationships, and more positive views of others. So part of agreeableness that's so important is the humans, we spend a lot of time and energy trying to get along with each other, and what agreeableness is really important for that. Now, you can imagine it, if someone is too agreeable, maybe they feel like they're taken advantage of, right? So there's no like right or wrong here in any of these spectrums. It's just kind of the spectrum of where we get. I think the only one that gets maybe more wrong is not the right word here, but like maybe the more difficult could be something like the more emotionally unstable I am, because that can cause the person all sorts of kind of turmoil. So neuroticism is linked more negative emotions in daily life, more health complaints, greater heart disease risk, and risk of lower life expectancy. So if someone who is just stressed out all the time, they're anxious all the time, that just destroys your physical body, your physical systems are breaking down. Stress hormones are really, really toxic and destructive over long periods of time. And life just sounds awful, right? Like every time you turn around, there's something else to worry about. We got one life here, and nobody really wants to spend it just worrying all the time. So people who sit further on that side are going to have more problems with their own health. Now, there's lots of ways to measure this. If you get online in the module, I want to warn you though. There's a lot of personality tests online that are just not that good. Now that you know a little bit about these theories, you can be much more discerning about which web pages are better than others. I put a link for you guys on the module on a personality for this Big 5 personality test. You should go ahead and take that, see how it goes. In fact, I'm going to ask you an exam question on this. In fact, one of your exam questions is going to have you compare and contrast two of these theories. And so listening to this lecture today, I think will really help you guys in that. And you got to see one test here. Before we leave Big 5, I'm just going to wrap things up with looking at some of the stuff that I didn't cover that's in the textbook. You have extroversion. You can see here with the different Big 5 some evidence with respect to genetics. And generally what's being said here is that genes seem to play a very strong role in these factors. So for example, if identical twins will score relatively high on these tests. Let me back up, sorry. With respect to each other. So like identical twins will score very similar on a Big 5 test compared to fraternal twins or non-identical twins. And some of these are really strong. Like introvert extrovert is very high, as you can see here, and so is openness. So you get these kind of clear differences. And the argument is that basically, like I said before, genetic influence may become stronger later in life. So, for example, by the time I'm an adult, my genetic influence may be much higher. When I'm a child, the environment may play a stronger role, right? And that environment can influence me for the rest of my life, right? So, I've had students talk about how when I was really little, I was super extroverted, and then as I went through school, I became more introverted. And, it could be due to negative experiences at school, maybe teachers making that person feel inferior, and they just kind of shrunk down, and that lingered. But really, maybe there's still a very strong part of them that is extroverted. So just that maybe that environment could have dampened it. There's a famous example of this where the role of the environment in development, okay, in personality and in ability. If you take here's just the example. You take 2 tomato plants and you put one of them in the best soil possible, lots of light, lots of water, and you put let me back up. Tomato seeds. You put a seed in one planter that's got lots of really great soil and water and sunlight. And another seed, the exact same seed, right, genetically or whatever, not the exact same seed, but just the same, another tomato seed that's just basically the same as the other one, and you put it in poor soil, poor lighting, not a lot of water, right? So the role of the environment is going to play have very obvious influences on the plant's development. The one in the good soil, good lighting, good water is going to grow to be a fruitful tomato plant, right? Giving off lots of tomatoes. Whereas the other plant, it may not grow. If it does grow, it may not yield very many tomatoes. And so that's not that much different from human beings. If I grow up in an environment where I'm discriminated against, I have these prejudices, or I'm poor, I have a difficult time, finding the right food. I grew up eating foods that are really bad for me, and my body doesn't fully develop normally, and my brain has some vitamin deficiencies and whatever. Or that I'm living in an environment where there's lots of toxic chemicals. Kids they used to find that, back in the 60s and 70s, kids growing up in cities were breathing in all this lead from the gasoline in cars, and it was causing intellectual damage to these kids' brains or intellectual abilities. And they were like, we got to get the lead out of gasoline, and that's why it's unleaded gasoline. You go to a gas station, there's no lead in it anymore because it was causing damage to children's brains. There's also seen studies where the closer you live to a freeway, children growing up near a freeway, breathing in all that exhaust all day long is not good for their brain development, and they could be measured. That could be detected on IQ scores. So it's not just simply genes. It's also about our environment and the role of the environment in our development. And Big 5 doesn't argue against that. It just says that it's just describing personality. It's not getting after the whys. So, okay, that's that, you guys. To wrap this up, I wanted to talk a little bit about the just the part of the textbook that goes after personality theory that's not covered here. And so, in the learning approaches, you've got, like we talked about it a lot in these two screencasts in terms of Skinner and the behavioral part, and with the social piece. The idea with Bandura, and again, this is not a really full explanation of the theory, but these two kind of go together. This idea that I've learned, Bandura and Skinner, you've got this social cognitive piece that I developed through observing others. I learn, my personality develops in part with all of these things here. So this theory composes all this stuff down here, okay? So for example, just to go back, in social cognitive theory, the concepts of reciprocal determinism, observation learning, and self-efficacy all play a role. So if, let's say, you were to on the discussion board, you were to just talk about this theory, you're gonna have to go and talk about all this stuff. So, which is fine. Just make sure you're explaining it, but you want to make sure you're kind of developing it. And how does this different from? Think about how this is different from Freud or Jung or Rogers or Big Five. Here you've got this complex relationship between behaviors, cognitive factors, situational factors, all working together to develop personality, and self-efficacy being a part of that. Another part of that theory, social cognitive, is this idea of locus of control. That we talked about this before in a screencast, where the more I believe I have control over things, that's going to directly influence my behavior, right? So if I believe that I can do really well in something, let's say class, let's say I want to go to medical school, and if I believe, hey, I can get into medical, it's going to take a lot of work, dedication, but I can do it, that's an internal locus of control. If it's, I can't because, I won't get in because I'm seen to be destined to just do something else in this kind of out of my control kind of way. That's part of the external pieces. Okay. All right, guys, that is that. I hope you have a fantastic rest of the week, and let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.